Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa says he's noted the preliminary report on Phala Phala, but will wait for the final report before making any commentary. This is after acting public protector Advocate Kholeka Gcaleka cleared him of wrongdoing in the Phala Phala farm scandal. In a preliminary report, Gcaleka also found that there's no proof the president was actively involved in the running of the farm. The acting public protector has, however, made adverse findings against the police for their handling of the matter. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Professor van Den Heever, who's with the Wits School of Governance. So, Professor, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us this morning. I want to start with this. I mean, how much weight can we or should we be attributing to this interim report?
Well, I think you can attribute reasonable weight to certain of the conclusions, particularly where they exonerate somebody. But where they implicate somebody, it's quite possible that feedback from those persons will actually result in an amendment to the report. So I would say that we really shouldn't be seeing a preliminary report. We should be seeing a final report only. And we won't know what kind of interactions will happen concerning this report from people who, for instance, are essentially going to be harmed by the outcome, because they will probably be very firm in their response.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you should mention that, because we've already heard from the Democratic Alliance's leader, John Steenhuisen, mentioning, issues of dispute, certain facts not having been captured correctly, currently in the process of compiling their own representations to make to the acting public protector. I mean, when you have an organization that is this involved in the investigation, can you expect, significant changes to the outcome of a report of this nature?
Well, I think you can, because it really depends on what kind of information is introduced to challenge the preliminary report. So on the one hand, to the extent that the Democratic Alliance raises real inconsistencies, logical inconsistencies, they might have to be taken into account by the public protector. They've also indicated that it looks like there's a fall guy, etc. That also depends very much on the nature of the evidence that has been presented to the public protector as well, and they will go only with what evidence they have. So that one will have to see how that comes out. But to the extent that they have to respond to various parties who are dissatisfied with the report, they would have to provide appropriate reasoning. Because as we've seen up until now with the previous, or for the current under impeachment public protector, is that these reports can be taken on review. And therefore you do have to make sure that the report itself is sound and has properly considered the evidence that was provided to it.
It's interesting to note, Prof, that we had, under those impeachment proceedings, the Section 89 panel, which came up with its own report that had adverse findings against the president, or at least found a prima facie evidence that the president may have violated the Constitution. We now have, another report, this time by the Office of the Public Protector, essentially clearing the president, noting that there is no conflict of interest with regards to his business and private interests and his roles and responsibility as president of the Republic. How should we make sense of these two seemingly independent, or on the face of it, independent inquiries into the same set of facts, coming up with, very different conclusions?
Well, it can be argued that the public protector has seen more detailed facts than the parliamentary inquiry. In the parliamentary inquiry, the question was, what was the quality of the evidence? And most of their conclusions was there may be a case to answer here. It wasn't that they formed a conclusive opinion on what has occurred, or a conclusive view. So I think that this hadn't passed the threshold, the test of whether or not the appropriate threshold, to say that based on evidence before them, they could form a coherent conclusion. And I think that they speculated in some senses on what could be the case here. But the issue with the public protector's report is, yes, it can go as far as it can with the evidence. But as a preliminary report, it's also got some questions to answer. I note that one of the reasons why the president is seen as not having a conflict is because he disclosed, for instance, this business in a confidential report. on his business dealings. Now, to me, the whole idea of eliminating conflicts of interest is the requirement for public disclosure of all of your business interests. So I'm quite interested in that particular feature because it doesn't seem as though it's appropriate for somebody to declare their interests within the office of the presidency itself as a way of saying, you're okay, this business is okay. We don't know. The public needs to know. And I would say I'm very interested in that particular aspect. The other issue is that Wally Ruet might come back to say he was instructed to do A, B, C, or D. He might do that to protect himself. He might be fairly loyal and basically, allow himself to become the fall guy. But he's also presented in his interviews, he's argued that he did brief the police, and there is no docket. So the question is really, where's the evidence that he actually briefed the police and that they were actually part of a legitimate investigation? So that does depend on the facts, and the question now is whether or not further facts are introduced to clarify that. So it's both the evidence, how did he get involved, how did somebody decide on this configuration from a police investigation perspective, who decided that and who took it forward, so who took the initiative. Those kinds of things are going to be important in the final report. And so I would not place a great deal of weight on the parliamentary inquiry, which didn't actually have all of the evidence before it. But I think now the public protector's process is not concluded, and probably there's still quite a few things to take into consideration.
One of those things to take into consideration, Prof, is the fact that just days before this leaking of this confidential interim report, we had the South African Reserve Bank come out in response to the DA's inquiry and note that the $580,000 US in foreign currency that really is at the heart of this entire scandal wasn't in fact declared once it entered South Africa's borders. Is that likely to in any way affect the outcome of this particular report?
I'm not sure, because the way in which SARS has dealt with it is that they've essentially placed an onus on who must declare, and that it's not the president's business that must declare that interest. It's essentially the person bringing the money in. And if it wasn't declared, that's the person who's at fault. So that might be the way in which that particular issue is addressed. And let's recall that this whole process, this whole event occurred during COVID as well, which means that people might argue that they might not have reported certain things timeously. In other words, the receipt of these funds because of the state of the country at the time. But those are areas that depend on both fact and law. And so I think I'd be very interested in seeing the Reserve Bank's response to this, but it may end up being a version of what SARS has put out. In other words, the problem lies with the person who brought the money in more than the person who received the money. And it was received at the farm by a farm manager, which also isn't the president. So those are issues that will have to be explored. But I think that the Public Protector's report is probably the more fundamental examination of the issue. And it may not end with a final report because the report itself may be taken on review. I think it's also important to note that this happens within the context of a factional struggle within the ANC itself between a group of people who want to oust the president and have their person put in charge. And that particular factional contest as well is going to be important going forward, because if the president is found in any way culpable, then it has huge implications for South Africa. Because of that factional struggle and whoever would actually replace him as president, if that were the case. So this is a process with consequences, and we will have to see how it plays out. But most certainly the people who want to see the president removed and replaced are far from blameless in taking actions in South Africa that are extremely harmful to the public interests. But as the Democratic Alliance indicates, we can't have anybody in high public office who is guilty of problematic and even potentially criminal conduct. Nobody must be in that position. But we actually do need to move toward a situation, probably through processes like this, in which the consequences for misconduct are addressed as a matter of public interest and proper accountability, rather than just a factional struggle between different players within the ruling, the governing party.
Yeah. I mean, on that note, Professor, when we get reports of this nature that present members of the public with, a conclusive response to this sort of open-ended question that's been lingering over our heads for months and months now, are the conclusions enough, or should we delve deeper and ask questions around whether or not this particular individual who occupies this high office in the executive passes constitutional muster? I mean, we have this public protector report that is not nearing its end anytime soon. We've got the DA still wanting to establish that Phala Phala ad hoc committee to look into the same set of facts. So really, we're looking at a very long road ahead. The conclusions of either of these processes, should they be enough to silence this matter once and for all, or should we delve deeper, ask deeper questions around whether or not this democracy even makes sense if we can have allegations of this nature swirling around, the head of state?
Yeah, I think that there are sort of two questions there. On the one hand, there is the issue of what can one actually prove at this point in time. And the public protector might be in a position where, at the end of the day, if somebody is sometimes found not guilty, it is not because they're not guilty, it is because there wasn't sufficient evidence against them that was presented in sort of a proper process to evaluate whether or not evaluate their guilt. In this particular instance, that could be the case. In other words, there can still be questions hanging, even though the public protector exonerates the president, and even if it goes through a court review process that agrees with the public protector. So that is always a possibility. It depends very much on what you can prove. And what we do know in a lot of the criminal conduct in the state is that where you have potential misconduct from a member of the executive, very often they don't do it in writing. It's conversations. It's conversations and directions that are given to people that can't be proven unless several witnesses come forward and disclose what actually happened. So if you don't have that, it's very difficult to prove it. But you can always prove, very often, the person who carried out the orders. You can prove what they did. And so that might be where a lot of questions are left hanging, and those are the kinds of questions that are left hanging around many members of the executive in the current government and previous administrations that we have to deal with properly. And so that question is not merely about this president, but also about how we deal with abuse of power and abuse of the state by members of the executive within government. It's deeply problematic. So I think that going forward, we do need to look at improving our accountability structures so that people who are in processes of review are also truly independent. Now, I raise that because if you go back through time and look at a lot of public protectors' reports, some of them and other bodies, the people that have been placed in these positions are potentially sympathetic to certain of the people that they're reviewing. And these reports can also be used to whitewash what's going on within government. So that's a very important issue. We've seen under the previous public protector what happens when you do have an independent public protector. You actually end up with massive results for accountability. Just in terms of the timescale of these investigations, we should note that the former president, Zuma, still hasn't been convicted of the crimes he was charged with prior to him becoming president. And that's also an indication of potentially an abuse of the court processes that has been allowed all the way through to essentially stall and delay a case where, in fact, there are substantial facts for a conclusive determination to occur. So all of those things are issues that we do as a society need to clarify, because we can't, the higher people go in government, the more power they have. And if we allow our institutions of accountability to be dominated by the people in those positions of power, then we don't have accountability, and it's incredibly dangerous, because then we have a country that is essentially can be manipulated at the discretion of people in high office in government, and they are not meant to be given that discretion. So it is important for us to look at this machinery and to say, is it sufficient? And I'm worried that we've had public protector reports in the past that have whitewashed what's been going on in government, and we've had public protector reports that haven't. And when you look at the difference,
Prof, unfortunately,
it's enormous.
Thank you so much. We are going to have to leave it there, but thank you for your insights and for coming on today's program. That's Professor Alex van Den Heever from the Wits School of Governance.